Now, the largest lake in the world is not Lake Superior. I hate to say this. I used to think it was the largest lake in the world because there's another lake that's called a sea. We don't say Lake Caspian. We say Caspian Sea. But if you look at the Caspian, you see it's a lake. It's such a large body of water. It's 153,000 square miles. It's almost the size of the state of California. Got it? Right. It's a lake. It's surrounded by what? By land. It's what we normally call a lake. I mean, we have this little lake. It's about the size of Lake St. Clair in Israel. They don't call it Lake Galilee. They call it the what? The Sea of Galilee. It's all relative, you know. It's what we call hype. If you want to elevate the name of your of your water, you don't call it a puddle. You call it a lake. You know, a lot of the puddles around here are called lakes. And if you don't like the word lake and you want to up its what? Its reputation, you call it a sea. It's called the Caspian Sea, but it is the largest lake in the world. And for a long while, it was simply a geographic oddity. And now it's of absolutely vital importance to the future of the United States of America. It's more important to us than Lake Superior. If Canada invaded and took the Upper Peninsula, so we wouldn't have the picture rocks. I mean, it wouldn't be, do you understand? I know some people are attached and some people were born in Ishpeming, I'm sorry. But it wouldn't be an overwhelming loss. The country would manage. But if the wrong people now take the Caspian Sea, we're in plenty of trouble. I'm going to call it the Caspian Sea. I could say Lake Caspian, but that's the name that has persisted through time, so I will say the Caspian Sea. If somebody takes this lake, this huge lake about the size of the state of California, we are in deep trouble. Many of you will not be able to get to the lectures because this lake, it is estimated, may contain around it and in it the largest petroleum and natural gas reserves in the world. It is estimated that there may be somewhere around 230 billion barrels. But stop counting, but it's 230 billion barrels of petroleum, either under or around this lake. We should only be so lucky with Lake Superior. I mean, it's an enormous oil reserve. Most of it has not yet been found. It is estimated. Now, what has been discovered, we're sure it's there, is somewhere close to 50 billion. But the estimate is far greater, 5 times as great. And that's why over here in Eurasia, or if you want to say it, between the continent of Asia and Europe. Europe is not a continent. Europe is a cultural concept. What we call Europe is part of a continent called Eurasia. It's not separate. But we don't want to be called Asiatics because we're what? Europeans. The way you would insult us is to call us what? Asiatics. So it's a cultural concept. We artificially separated this body of land from Asia so that we would never be confused with Asiatics. But if you look at the story of the continent, people are moving back and forth between Europe and Asia because it's one and the same continent. So on the western edge, or sort of in the middle of this continent, Eurasia is this lake. Today, there are 5 countries around it. Prior to 1991, there were 2. Most of the sea, most of the lake, was surrounded by something called the Soviet Union. Does anybody remember the Soviet Union? It was around up until 1991. The whole west side, the whole north side, and the whole east side was the Soviet Union. The only part that didn't belong to the Soviet Union was the south side. The south side belonged and belongs to a country which is certainly very controversial, Iran. I mentioned Iran last week because Iran is the connecting link here. Iran is the major country on the Persian Gulf. So on the southern edge, there is an old Irish phrase, it's mazel, means luck. Do you understand? On the southern side is oil. And on the northern side, do you understand? The greatest reservoirs known. There may be a huge reservoir under Detroit, I don't know. But the greatest reservoirs known are here in the Persian Gulf and the what? The Caspian. And Iran is right in the middle of it. It's the connecting link between the story of last week and the story this week. Because if you talk about the Persian Gulf, you're talking about what? Iran. If you're talking about the Caspian, you're also talking about Iran. But Iran only had, what, a little itsy-bitsy part on the southern edge. The whole sea, virtually, belonged to the Soviet Union. Now there are 5 countries because the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. And in fact, 4 republics, or 3 republics, of the Soviet Union that faced the Caspian Sea are now theoretically and in reality independent. So, the Soviet Union is gone. Russia is now there. Russia still controls a section of the Caspian. The Caspian is very important because you can't talk about Russia without talking about the Caspian. If you think of a river in Russia with boatmen, the Volga. All right. The Volga rises up here somewhere near St. Petersburg and makes a curve around, and where does it empty up into? Into Lake Caspian, or the Caspian Sea. So the mouth of the Volga is in the hands of the Russians, and a little bit of territory to the south now. But now, to the east, there is a country that was part of the Soviet Union, one of the republics, that is now independent. The name of this country is Kazakhstan, right? And it's huge. It's over 1 million square miles. It's larger than any nation territorially in Africa. It's huge. And it borders on the Caspian Sea. And then south of Kazakhstan is another country or nation that was part of the Now, Turkmenistan is a country about the size of California. It's about the size of the Caspian Sea. But because it's mainly a sandy desert, likely is somewhere closer to 20 million, but Turkmenistan has about 5. And then right across from Turkmenistan and right next to Iran is a little country, the capital of which is Baku. The name of this country, which used to be part of the Soviet Union, is Azerbaijan. The people in Azerbaijan can be called by 2 names. The long name, which you don't need, is Azerbaijani. The short name, which is the correct way really, is Azeri, A-Z-E-R-I. And in fact, this little country, which has an area which is about the size of the lower peninsula of Michigan, has a population close to 8 million, which sort of corresponds, after the auto crisis, that's where Michigan may be. So about 8 million people, and that's on the Caspian Sea. So you've got 5 countries. 4 of them were part of the Soviet Union: Russia, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, and Iran, which was not. When Putin says that the greatest disaster that ever happened to Russia was the dissolution of the Soviet Union, do you understand? He is absolutely right. Because prior to 1991, most of this lake was controlled by the Russians. Now, the Caspian Sea is famous for things other than oil. There is a fish called the sturgeon. Right. And from the eggs of the sturgeon comes something that some people, they would die for it. One of the most expensive things to eat in the world. It's called caviar. And there's some people that can't stand it. I mean, you could offer it to them, they wouldn't eat it. So I just want to find out, how many people here like caviar? How many people don't like it? Look at this. How did it ever get to be so expensive? I mean, with all these people who don't like it. Anyway, and in fact, the story of the sturgeon is going to be involved here. It's going to be one of the issues. Because if you are digging up the lake to find oil, what's going to happen to the caviar? All right, so it's not a major issue, but certainly is one of the issues that we have to deal with. And for those people who are totally in love with caviar, listen very carefully to this talk, because it will relate to the future. Now, in order to understand the lake, let me tell you about the people who lived around it. I mean, there's a history here, because we just can't start with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Because for most of human history, these 5 nations did not exist around this lake. The first people that we know of to show up that had a history, that wrote down their history so we know something about them in this area, were a people called the Aryans. A-R-Y-A-N-S, a term much misused by Hitler. The Aryans were a people who lived basically in Central Asia and the Ukraine, and they produced a whole series of very important nations that ultimately moved south. One group invaded India, conquered India, and became the rulers of India. They, to some degree, still are, and they brought a famous language with them called Sanskrit. Another group invaded Afghanistan and Iran, and in fact the name Iran comes from the word Aryan, and they were to produce great nations like the Persians, and the Medes became dominant. They're called the Persians. They conquered all the other nations, and they created what is called the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire basically took most of the Caspian Sea. The Persians moved up into the Caucasus, they moved up into what we call Central Asia, and the Caspian was theirs. The Caspian Sea was not terribly important to them. There was no resource that they extracted other than fish from the Caspian Sea that would be important. They didn't go exploring up the Volga or anything like that. It was there. Did they go to the beach? I don't know. It was not, do you understand? In terms of the Persian Empire, although they had it, it wasn't something that was viewed as valuable. In fact, the Caspian area was sort of problematic. On the eastern side of the Caspian, there's a terrible desert, which is a sort of extension of the Gobi. I mean, it's just a sand desert. So what would you do with it? Without modern technology to turn a desert into green lawns, I mean, what are you going to do with it? And on the other side were these horribly high mountains, which are certainly gorgeous and wonderful for skiing if you don't want to get killed by the Chechens. But I mean, they're called the Caucasus. They're called the Caucasus Mountains. Hard to climb over, whatever else it was. And not only that, along the shore, it's deserty. So if you were into agriculture or something like that, it wasn't something that you could do anything with. And quite frankly, the Persians didn't. Along the way, the Persians were conquered by a people that came from the south. They're called the Arabs. And the Arabs brought with them a religion, a very powerful religion, which is part of our story because part of the problem around the Caspian is this religion called Islam. And the Persian people, who had their own Aryan religion, which we call Zoroastrianism, gave it up. And they were either voluntarily or forcibly converted to Islam. So now all the people around there are what? Are Muslim. The Persians kept their language, but they gave up their religion and they became Muslims. And as you know, the Muslim world from the beginning was divided up into an argument that is still going on and is costing hundreds and thousands of lives in Iraq and elsewhere. There are two groups of Muslims who hate each other. One group are called the Sunnis, and the other group are called the Shiites, and their theological differences are irrelevant because most Sunnis and Shiites can't explain to you what the theological differences are. All they know is that their ancestors hated each other. And that's, do you understand? And that's enough. They don't even know what the argument is. So now the Aryan, the Persian world turns into a Muslim world, and now the Muslims arrive on the what? The shores of Lake Caspian with their argument, the Sunnis and the Shiites. All right. Now the second major group to arrive in the area are called by linguists the Altaics. They're called Altaics because there is a group of mountains up here called the Altai Mountains, which are just to the west of, not the largest lake, but the deepest lake in the world. An absolutely exquisite lake. It's called Lake Baikal. And just to the west of it are these mountains, not that high, but not that low. They're called the Altai. And these people are called Altaic because they came, that was their homeland. They came from that mountain area and then they spread out to the west and to the east. The Altaic people have two divisions. The eastern division is called the Mongols. And in fact, there is a country called Mongolia, and we know about the great Chinggis Khan and the Mongol Empire and whatever else. The Western Altaics, who look like the Mongols, they came from the same people. Flat faces, eye folds, high cheekbones, are called the Turks. The Turks and Mongols have the what? The same origin. They came from the Altaic Mountains, and they spread out, and they were on a surge. Now, what happened first that was the Turks. The Turks were on the move, and they came west, and they invaded the Persian Empire, and they conquered it. So the whole Persian Empire, which had become part of the Arab Empire, was now taken by the Turks, and Lake Caspian now falls under the control of Turks. There are Turks to the left, Turks to the right, the north, the whole Caspian Sea falls under the control of the Turks. And in fact, we can see that because one of the countries that now is on the Caspian Sea is called Turkmenistan, because Turks in English were often called Turkmen. So Turkmenistan is one of the spots where they settled on their way to the invasion of Iran and to the invasion of Persia. But now come the Turks, and they settle down. And the Turks are followed by the Mongols. The Mongols first head east, take China. And then in the 13th century, they sweep west and they absorb the Turks. Many of the Turkish tribes, since they basically spoke related languages and their cultures were what? Very much the same. Half the Mongol hordes were Turks. And they swept all the way westward. In fact, they entered Russia. And they conquered Russia. And the Mongols reached the center of Germany. Along the way, they also defeated the Turks who were in control of the Persian Empire. And the Caspian Sea now fell under their control. Ultimately, what followed in this Mongol world, which lasted for many centuries, the Mongols controlled almost all of Central Asia. And at the heart of this empire was this Mongol people, but not simply a Mongol people. There weren't enough Mongols. So ultimately, the Mongols made an alliance with the Turks. And they produced a people who were part Mongol and part Turkish. Sometimes they spoke Turkish, and sometimes they spoke Mongol, and sometimes they spoke a language that was like in the middle. In fact, there's a name that describes these people. It comes from Mongol. They're called Moguls. The Moguls are the people who conquered what? They conquered India. So, and their lifestyle is very important for understanding what happened to the Caspian. They were overwhelmingly pastoral people. They raised sheep and goats and horses. The horses were their war instruments. And since I've been to this area 3 times, I mean, I see the kids that simply jump on a horse bareback and what? They're 4 years old, and it's embarrassing. And they just go off riding. They're a pastoral people. They live in tents. Even when in modern times many of them were offered what we call modern housing, they didn't like modern housing. They wanted to be with their animals and with their tents. Their favorite drink, and I tasted it only once, is fermented mare's milk. They think it's nectar. But that is their favorite drink. And in fact, they were divided up into families, clans, tribes. If you bring together a large number of tribes on the move, instead of calling them a nation, they're called a horde. Now, the reason why the word horde has what I would call a pejorative overtone is because these hordes came and invaded Europe and other places, but so many of them emerged. And when the Mongols took the area, they divided up into various hordes. So let me mention the hordes that are important, because the nations that will appear along the Caspian Sea to some degree belong to them. All right. The most famous of the hordes was the Golden Horde. The Golden Horde controlled Russia and controlled most of western Siberia and large parts of what today is Kazakhstan. All right? So it was the Great Golden Horde, and its capital, Sarai, was at the mouth of the Volga River. And the man who ruled the Golden Horde was called the Great Khan, which is a Turkish-Mongol word. And in fact, the great princes of the Russians, including the Grand Prince of Moscow, had to show up every year in Sarai with his rear end up in the air and his head to the what? To the ground, bringing special gifts to the Great Khan of the Golden Horde. The other great horde was the Eastern Horde, which was to be centered in Mongolia. They never converted to Islam. The Golden Horde did, like the Turks. They converted to Islam. They spent 3 centuries rampaging through the Muslim world, and then they converted. The Eastern Mongols converted to Buddhism. And so there was a religious difference between them, which ultimately was to separate them. And then there was a third group who were called the Moguls, and they were down here. Ultimately, the Moguls would disappear, and the 2 hordes that were there, the Eastern Horde and the Western Horde, survived. And the Caspian Sea, to a large degree, was under the control of the Western Horde. The Western Horde would ultimately split in 2. And that's important for understanding one of the problems in the area. It didn't produce more wealth around the Caspian, but it happened. The southern part of the horde went into farming. The northern part of the horde stayed with goats, sheep, and horses. All right? Now that provides you what? 2 different lifestyles. The southern part of the horde got a new name, named after one of their chiefs. His name was Uzbek, and so they're called the what? Uzbeks. So the farmer Mongols were what? Uzbeks, and the sheep or the shepherd Mongols got a name. The name, which means rider, is Kazakh. The name is preserved. There's a group of Russians who bear the name. They're called Kazakhs, right? So it's the same thing. They're the people on the horses with their sheep, and the shepherds hated the farmers, and the farmers hated the shepherds, but they have the Caspian. The Caspian is theirs. Do they know what to do with the Caspian? They don't even eat caviar. I mean, a Mongol wouldn't eat fish. Mongols eat mutton. Mutton and milk, milk and mutton, mutton and milk, that's it. I mean, you can have an available food supply around, but if you're not culturally attuned to it, you won't use it. I mean, dogs are an available food supply for us. Now, you get Americans to eat dogs. You tell me. You get Americans to eat dogs. You tell me. They wouldn't. So fish is out of the question. So even sturgeon is what? It's not even available to it's there, I mean, but you wouldn't eat it. These people came out of the steppes. Now, the third group of people that are very important are the Russians. The Russians rebel against the Mongols in the 14th century. And they declare their independence, and the Grand Prince of Moscow becomes the leader of the rebellion. So Moscow now becomes the center of Russia. And in fact, the Grand Prince of Moscow now takes a title, Caesar. He calls himself the Tsar. The Russians are a people who are not Muslim, and they're not Buddhist. They have been converted to Christianity. Not the Western version of Christianity, but the Eastern version of Christianity, which we call Greek Orthodoxy, or it's called what? Russian Orthodoxy. And now they're on a roll. The great Tsar that defeated the Mongols, he built the most famous building in Moscow, or maybe in Russia, in honor of his victory. It's sometimes called Our Lady of Kazan, on the Volga River. It's a church in right there on Red Square. In the 16th century, on the Volga River, at a place called Kazan, he met the armies of the Mongols, who were sometimes called Tatars, and he crushed them, and he defeated them, and he took the Volga. And having done that, he had the taste of conquest, so he kept moving eastward. And ultimately, over the next 100 years, the Russians reversed everything. The Mongols had come to what? Conquer them. Now the Russians went out to conquer the Mongols. The Mongols lived in what today is Siberia. They lived in what today is Kazakhstan. So the Russians are heading all the way straight across until they reach the Pacific. They don't even stop at the Pacific. They cross over to Alaska. They don't even stop at Alaska. They're heading down for San Francisco. I mean, they're moving. It's one of the greatest land conquests in the history of the world. The Russians reversed it. And a large part of the Mongols now fall under the control of the Russians. In fact, the Russians capture the mouth of the Volga. And then they move south. They take the Kazakhs. And having taken the Kazakhs, they move even south, further south. They take all the Uzbeks, and along the way, they take this people who are related to the Mongols, the Turkmen, who are on the Caspian. All of that falls under the control of the Russians. By 1800, yes, you go to Kazakhstan now. I mean, I was in Almaty, which is the old capital. Nazarbayev did something which was very interesting. The old capital of Kazakhstan is right on the border here, not too far from China. It was called Almaty, now it's called Almaty. But he didn't want to leave the capital there because in the north, most of the people are Russians. So he moved the Kazakh capital into a swamp in the north. The city was called Akhmola. It's now called Astana. Astana is the way you say capital in Kazakh. And he's moved the whole government there, and what he's saying is, I want you to know, you Russians, you're living in Kazakhstan. Don't think you will what? Ever return to Russia. So he ordered a capital, not even President Bush can, I mean, could he move the capital from Washington, D.C. to Butte, Montana? No, I mean, he did. That's his power. He just moved the whole national capital. When I arrived, they were moving records. Then I arrive, the hotel, I mean, it is five-star. The boulevard streets are being built. You can see the beginning of what we would call the beginnings of a prosperous middle class. Money, do you understand? The oil money is beginning to seep in, so it's fairly rapid development. Do these people know how to adjust to all that? It doesn't make any difference. The point is, you're going to see dramatic development. In Baku now, there was a photograph in the New York Times, and there were these two very fashionably dressed Azeri women going by Gucci. So I already you know. I mean, you can see what is happening. All right. 3, there will be continuing repression. hopefully the American government learned its lesson in what? Uzbekistan. If they try to play that trick on Nazarbayev, they will what? He will turn to the Chinese or the Russians. That's it. Over, finished, I don't need you. And if they try it with Aliyev in Azerbaijan, it's going to be the what? The same thing. So I want to make a prediction that the United States of America will make an exception when the government keeps talking about shipping democracy all over the world. They will not be talking about Kazakhstan or Turkmenistan or Azerbaijan, because if they do, they're going to end up with this much petroleum and no significant pipelines. And the confrontation in the area is great because if I'm the president of Kazakhstan, I'm Nazarbayev, and I don't want to get lectured on democracy, whatever else it is, I have alternatives for the development of my oil fields, don't I? The Russians, you can't depend on the Russians, their management, the resources, but right next door is this expanding economy, the most spectacular economy in the world. It's called the what? The Chinese economy. And they would have no political objection to the kind of government. So why do I have to deal with heartburn or whatever it is? I mean, whatever they're giving me, you know? Goodbye. See, Americans never think of alternatives. Is there anybody else with money? Couldn't be. So we have to tread what? Very carefully. So now if you want a movie about international intrigue with Chinese agents, Russian agents, American agents doing killing each other in hotel rooms or whatever else, the setting, I want you to get used to the movies, right? The new movies are going to be set in Almaty or Astana or Baku, or maybe they'll even give us Ashgabat from MGM. I do not know. But if you learned anything this morning, you learned that there is a lake in the world, the largest lake in the world, which is becoming one of the major places for world competition and world tension. It's called the Caspian Sea, and it means more than caviar. Thank you all very, very much.